This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, here to kick things off for this week's episode. Today, we're joined by Stéphane Lavertu, author of a new study on Ohio's high-achieving, low-income, or HALO students. The report finds that their access to advanced learning opportunities plays a big role in whether these students make it to four-year colleges. Then, on the Research Minute, David shares a study tracking the same group of Britons from childhood to age 50, revealing how early cognitive skills shape later life outcomes, from education and occupation to wages. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please welcome a return guest to the Education Gadfly Show, Stéphane Lavertu. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
Great to have you here. Stéphane is the author of a new study we are going to be talking about, study for the Fordham Institute. It is called The Leaky Pipeline, Assessing the College Outcomes of Ohio's High-Achieving Low-Income Students. Whew! Before we get to all that, let me welcome my co-host, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Stéphane. Always a pleasure.
You know, Stéphane, we are grateful for you joining us, not only because you're the author of the study, also a Fordham Institute fellow, but that you are powering through a bad cold, as you told us about before the show started. Thank you for doing that. So I think that's great. You can really say, you know, if this goes great, fantastic. If you say something you regret, you know, we'll just say, hey, he's hopped up on Sudafed. So you can't, you know, it's not fair to take, to hold him accountable for that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Well, Stéphane, this is a really important study and excited to talk about it. Let's talk about the study and all things advanced education on Ed Reform Update. Okay, Stéphane, so this study looks at a group of kids that we and other people have used this term before, called HALO kids, high achieving, low income students. In this study focused on Ohio, you go back in time, roll back the tape. You find kids who in third grade popped up as high achieving on the state assessment. You then follow those kids throughout their K through 12 trajectory and into and through college, which is super cool. And you are able to compare how kids who were low income high achievers did compared to affluent high achievers. And then also you were able to compare those HALO kids who did go all the way into college to those who did not, to try to understand what is happening with the pipeline. And that pipeline metaphor, you know, people use it all the time, but it's a good one. You know, the notion is, if we want to help all kids achieve their potential, and if we want to make sure that, for example, low-income kids have a shot at getting into and through college, including selective colleges, including, by the way, kids of color who are themselves from low-income families, well, we got to think about the pipeline, right? You can't start thinking about this problem in 12th grade. We've been arguing here on the show and elsewhere, you've got to start early. So let's go back again in Ohio to third grade and see what that pipeline looks like. Let me read just one of the findings that I think is, you know, both powerful but also super sobering. And it is, oh, I'm sorry, I had it right here. Okay. If you go back to that third grade, you find that HALO students are outnumbered 3-1 by their more affluent counterparts in the top achievement quintile. Again, that's in third grade. That's not too surprising. There's going to be disparities for a whole lot of reasons by class. But okay, 3-1, they're outnumbered. But then a decade later, they are outnumbered 6-1 in four-year colleges and 10-1 in the most selective colleges. 10-1. So we go from 3-1 to 10-1. And I think what we would say is that is an extremely leaky pipeline. So tell us more. What do we know about why this pipeline is so leaky? And when we look at the success, when we look at the kids who are making it, what does it seem to be that their schools might be doing to make that more likely?
Gosh, there's a lot in that's great. That's a great summary. There's a lot in the report, so I'm trying to decide what to pick out to answer the question that you just posed. I will say,
and don't worry, Stéphane, if you leave something out that I wanted you to say, I'll say it myself.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'll go back to some of the things you said, and before we took on this project, what you said to me is folks lately have focused on more proximate causes. And so there are things that happen in high school in terms of preparation that people have tended to focus on. In addition to what colleges are doing in their recruitment, you might look at some coursework that they chose to take or places they chose to apply in high school. And those things surely still matter in between third grade and attending college. So we don't want to dismiss that entirely. There are things going on at the later stages that do matter, but there's a lot going on earlier than that. And so, one thing we know for sure is that the low-income kids are even smaller share of high achievers by the time they get to eighth grade, right? They're outnumbered something like 4-1, for instance. We also see that coursework, we see the leaky pipeline. I mean, it really does look like a leaky pipeline when you look at coursework. Low-income kids compared to their more affluent, high-achieving peers are something like 36% less likely to take advanced math coursework in middle school. And then they're even less likely than that to take AP coursework in high school, for instance. So we see it from the very beginning all the way through high school. There's more and more leakage until we get to the point where in the top colleges, the ones we've defined as those where students are comparably high achieving, in the top 20% in terms of admissions exams, it's 10-1. So there's a lot going on, but it starts at the very early stages.
Yeah, and like you say, the stuff at the end matters. I'm sure people would say, oh, well, maybe some of this is about college costs, right? Some of those low-income kids can't afford to go to some of those selective colleges or think they can. Maybe they don't have all the information we wish they had about financial aid that's available and scholarships and the like. But if you start earlier, it makes a difference. And what's maddening is that you've got these kids that we know, we can identify them. I mean, the state of Ohio literally knows their names, right? But they popped up and they did well on the third grade test. And then they go through school and they're not being given access to advanced math courses, for example, starting in middle school. Now, a bunch of states are trying to work on this by having these automatic enrollment policies that say, hey, if you're one of these kids that pops up on the state test doing really well, then the school has to put you in the advanced math class as the default. I mean, you can, of course, get out of it if you really don't want to, but that should be the default so that we start to plug this leaky pipeline and make it likelier. The affluent kids, mostly in their affluent suburban schools, are getting access to those courses. So too should be the low-income kids. And like you say, AP, which, by the way, I mean, I feel like we should all be talking about advanced placement way more than we do. I mean, study after study keeps popping up that this initiative makes a difference. And it's one of the great success stories around scaling an initiative in this country. And I feel like we just, I don't know, we take it for granted or we just poo-poo it or what. But again, it matters. Now, the other thing that I thought was really interesting was that the only thing that seems to matter is if these kids find themselves around other high-achieving students. Now, Ohio doesn't have a whole lot of these test-in schools like the famous ones in New York City, the Stuyvesants and Bronx Science, but there's a few. There are a few in Cleveland and in Cincinnati, and there's also some charter schools that tend to focus on a lot of high achievers, and they pop up as being schools that are good for those kids. But there's others as well. J.D. Vance's alma mater in Middletown, Ohio, pops up looking pretty good. Some suburban schools where some low-income kids are, one way or another, are able to make it to those, their families figured out a way to get them into those suburban schools or live in those suburbs. And they're surrounded by other high achievers. That seems to matter too, which is something that maybe folks on the left would find interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's like two main ways, I guess, as far as the study is concerned, to get access to high achievers. And that's highly predictive of whether you're going to go on to higher education at a four-year college. One of them is you go to a suburban districts where there are a lot of high achievers. And so that's one way. If you're a low-income student, and there aren't many of them, who happens to get access to a suburban school, where there are a lot of high achievers, your trajectory changes. After third grade, suddenly it changes pretty dramatically. But even if you stay within your city school district, you can have a sudden change in your trajectory. In Cleveland, there are 5 selective, they call them criteria schools. And for the top high poverty schools in terms of getting kids into college, 4 of the 5 high schools in Cleveland made the list. It's very clear. It's a very strong relationship. You get with high achieving peers, you have better prospects. And you can imagine all sorts of mechanisms explaining this. Some of this might be, the sort of thing that Carolyn Hawksby talked about and other folks who are saying, well, colleges will target high schools with high concentrations of high achievers, or maybe places where there are a lot of AP credits being handed out, and that's a good way to recruit. But we also know that being surrounded by high achieving peers has a causal impact on students' outcomes. What you said earlier about it being maddening, that we don't put some of these students in algebra by default in 8th grade at least, is absolutely right. Andrew McCacken had a paper that showed very convincingly, I think this was based on California data, that if you put high achievers into algebra early, they're going to do well. And there was this other paper more recently that showed that part of the mechanism that explains this potentially is peer effects. And so you end up in a classroom with other high achievers, and who knows, what other benefits come from that.
Yeah. David, let's get you in here. We've been having a debate here, but also on my Substack, on School, to try to say, hey, how do we get this issue to be less polarized, which frankly means getting more folks on the left comfortable with thinking about advanced kids? If we're talking about Halo kids in particular, that seems like a sweet spot. My experience is that, there's definitely groups on the left like Education Trust who have been great on the issue of expanding access to AP in the high school grades and to advanced courses now in middle school, including this automatic enrollment policy. But a lot of groups and folks on the left, I find, are still nervous about anything in the elementary grades, especially if you call it gifted education, but just anything too early. We're seeing this play out in the New York City debate. I mean, but the argument is you got to start early. You could say even 6th grade is pretty late. So start earlier. What's wrong with that argument, or how do we make it better to our friends on the left, David, as our emissary of the left?
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily accept me as that, but I think first of all, I just cannot emphasize enough the need to stay away from the G word, right? It's not just a distinction without a difference, right? Like I think most people who are any kind of, even marginally towards the center, recognize that different, kinds of kids need different levels of instruction, right? Depending on where they come into the classroom. Everybody understands that, right? The only way you're going to scare people away from that position is if you give some sense that it's inevitable, or that you're trying to pick up on like their innate ability, that it might somehow be genetic. We all know there's a grain of truth to that, but it's politically toxic, and it's, as a practical matter, really difficult to disentangle from all the other forms of structural disadvantage, yada, yada, yada. It's not a winner, right? And so I just think that advanced education is the right way to frame it, right? Like, I don't know why this kid came in advanced. It probably has something to do with his or her innate ability, but it also probably has to do with a lot of other things. And we don't care, because nobody really thinks that we should be holding kids back if they're ready for more, right? I don't want to say that nobody thinks that, but almost nobody thinks that. And yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious for Stéphane's perspective on it after kind of going deep, right? Because I do have a different take. I think most people, if you can get them to let their guard down, are not against this. And so I'm not quite sure why it's so hard. My gut feeling is that maybe our educators are just sort of conditioned to engage in triage, or they're too busy with other things in high poverty settings. But I'm curious to know what Stéphane thinks.
Well, I've wondered about this as well. And it's sort of, to me, it reminds me of the school choice battles, where we're willing to give affluent parents a choice to put their kids in districts, in classrooms with high achieving peers who will have access to AP. And suddenly, when it comes to giving low achieving kids access to those sorts of peers, we see a problem with it.
I mean,
And so
low income. Yeah.
low income, excuse me. Yeah, and so I find that puzzling, and I think if we talk about it in those terms, maybe it resonates a little bit more. But the fact that people have been able to defend, suburban districts putting up these walls around urban districts, and not even recognize that that's a form of school choice that benefits the affluent. To me, it makes me pessimistic that we might, convince parents or folks on the left to buy into to giving more opportunity to high achieving low income kids.
Yeah. Speaking of the walls, I mean, I think what you're referring to, but tell me if I'm wrong, is in Ohio, there is a policy, has been for a long time, to promote inter-district choice. But the policy allows districts to decide whether to accept students from other districts or not. And guess what? The vast majority of Ohio's 600 plus school districts participate, except for the affluent suburban districts that ring each of the big 8 urban districts. And if you want to, if you want to look at a picture that is systemic racism, I mean, there it is, right? I mean, these places literally do put up walls and say, sorry, we're not interested in getting those kids from Cleveland, from Dayton, from, at one point, I think in an email back and forth, I floated an idea. Everybody told me this was a terrible idea, and maybe you will too, that says, well, I mean, first of all, okay, we should have a state policy that says you're not allowed to do that. Suburban districts, you got to take the kids if you have space. You all have space because of declining enrollment. That, I agree, that would be the best policy. Second best policy would be to say, how about letting them cherry pick, right? And say, hey, what about saying, will you at least accept high achieving kids from Cleveland, from Dayton, from Columbus, so that they can benefit from being around other high achievers, right? I mean, of course, again, people on the left hate this if it's in the context of private school choice, or charter schools get accused of cherry picking. I'm saying, hey, let those suburban districts cherry pick. If that means getting at least some of the kids, these halo kids, access to peers and to challenges and opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. Stéphane doesn't want to say
Political fantasy, but I don't hate it on principle.
Well, there you go. Yeah. All right. And final point I'd say on this, on the politics, that big Decide to Win report that just came out from the center left group, Welcome. They polled a bunch of education issues, and the least popular issue by far wasn't abolishing the Department of Ed. It was ending tracking. People like tracking. The idea of ending tracking was something like 40 points underwater. So friends on the left, trying to abolish tracking, not popular. So maybe that'll convince you. All right, Stéphane. Well, great work. I do hope there is so much more in there than we have time to get into, but you can really get some rich information, including we have these, Stéphane's got the lists of the high schools that do particularly well for these kids, which is super interesting. So check it out. Again, it's called the Leaky Pipeline, Assessing the College Outcomes of Ohio's High Achieving Low Income Students. Stéphane, thank you, and I hope you get well soon.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
All right, now it's time for everyone's favorite, David's Research Minute. David, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Mike. Good to be back.
It's almost like you were just here, like you never left.
Yeah, I barely have my time to catch my breath here. I gotta commentate, and then I gotta research minute in a single afternoon. So
double hitting, doing 2 jobs here. David, a little cruel of you. A lot of people out of work these days in education, and yet here you are doing 2 jobs.
Yeah, and doing them both in a very average fashion, Mike. So I have no defense.
Not true, not true. All right, well, what you got for us this week on the Research Minute?
Yeah, I have a study called Cognitive Skills Beyond Childhood. It is by Yuta Bolt. and it is published in the Economic Journal as of basically this week, which is the flagship journal of the Royal Economic Society, which is based in the United Kingdom. So this is one of those international studies that we do every now and then. According to the author, the key contribution of this paper is to compare and contrast the development of human capital as approximated by test scores versus wages using the same sample of individuals. And we'll get into that. For data, the author uses data from the National Child Development Study, which is a longitudinal cohort that started with, I love this part, almost all individuals who were born in Great Britain in 1 week in March 1958. So
Really?
Yes.
That's how they drew the sample?
Apparently. So let's hope there is no, I don't know. Let's hope there wasn't any inclement weather over Yorkshire that week that was somehow had an effect on cognitive achievement or something like that. Anyway, it is what it is. You cannot get longitudinal studies without winding up somewhere in Europe, in the 50s or 60s. So that's how it works. All right. So individuals were first surveyed at birth. And then followed up at ages 7, 11, 16, 23, 33, 42, 46, 50, and 55. And then extensive cognitive testing was conducted with individuals at ages 7, 11, 16, as well as 50. In childhood, that cognitive testing included reading and math, along with some other kind of squirrely activities that were designed to assess individual's ability to sort of recall things from memory, draw a person who looked like a person, and just other things that are designed to assess their sort of intellectual capacity. In adulthood, that is when at age 50, there is a slightly different set of measures that are more focused, I would say, on executive function and what's generally referred to as fluid intelligence as opposed to crystallized intelligence. Most of my questions around the study have to do with the differences between these measures, because ultimately they just didn't ask exactly the same things that at 7, 11, and 16 that they did at 50, and consequently, it sort of limits the conclusions that you can draw from the study, in my opinion. Okay, so having put that on the table, what does the author find? Well, first of all, the first finding is that these cognitive skills in childhood persist strongly into adulthood. So essentially, you can tell how much someone's going to do on a skills test when they are 50 to a fairly good degree based on how they do at 16 or even at 11 or even at 7. So that's not shocking. We all know that some folks have higher cognitive skills and others have lower, but it is striking in the author's view how persistent cognitive skills are. However, the author argues that wages at 50 are actually better predicted by cognitive skills at 16 than they are by cognitive skills at 50. And this is where it gets interesting because, as I mentioned, there's some question here around whether the cognitive skills that we're measuring are the same. Nevertheless, the author does some tests that kind of show that it doesn't necessarily matter what types of cognitive skills you're talking about in childhood. They all seem to predict wages and cognitive ability fairly well in adulthood. After that, the author sort of does a bunch of tests to kind of see, well, okay, if we control for this or that, what else matters? And so the third finding is that education predicts higher cognitive skills and wages at age 50, conditional on cognitive skills at age 16. And in fact, education is basically the only thing that predicts both higher cognitive skills and higher wages after controlling for your cognitive ability as a kid. Following up on that, the fourth finding is that occupational choice predicts wages, but not these sort of generalizable or general cognitive skills, which is also fairly intuitive. So, once you've controlled for childhood cognitive ability, whether or not you're a lawyer or, working with your hands does not necessarily predict your cognitive skills at 50. And then finally, the time that you spend out of the labor market, so if you're unemployed, obviously predicts lower wages, not surprising, but it does not seem to have any impact on your cognitive skills at 50, which I personally thought was kind of interesting, because we can at least imagine that cognitive ability might deteriorate if someone is just not able to participate in work on a daily basis. Okay, so collectively, the author argues that these last few facts suggest that the processes that predict general cognitive skills are not tightly related to the processes that predict labor market specific skills. And they also observe that a very low share of cognitive skills at 50 are explained by human capital investments in adulthood. So basically, nothing really matters when you're talking about adult cognitive ability. And so what all this is driving towards, I would argue, is a very big question, which is basically, does what you make in adulthood, is it ultimately driven by your cognitive ability in adulthood, or is it driven by sort of other things that happen along the way? And what the author wants to argue is essentially that childhood cognitive ability allows you to access a set of other educational investments, college, job training, networks, that in turn predict adult wages. So essentially that this childhood period of, sorry, let me try that again. So in a nutshell, what the author wants to argue is that your cognitive ability in childhood allows you to access a set of educational and workforce investments that ultimately allow you to get higher wages in adulthood, and that this actually matters more than what your cognitive ability in adulthood is.
Yeah, it's okay. Whew, that's a lot. Thank you, David. It's a lot. So, all right, so let's unpack this. I mean, this is the big finding that I saw, and I think it was first maybe in Tyler Cohn's blog, was this notion that the skills at 16 are more predictive of your wages at 50 than the wages than your skills at 50, and that just seems counterintuitive, right? In that you would think, oh well, surely it matters what kind of skills you have. That's why what you're getting paid for. But I think the point, again, like you said, we can all understand what your cognitive skills are at 16 puts you on a certain trajectory. And if that trajectory includes higher education and then also, certain kinds of jobs, at the high end, it means white collar work and professional opportunities, that sets you up in most cases, unless something, you fall off the trajectory for higher wages at age 50. And that's pretty interesting. I think it's also kind of hints at this question about college, like, and this is always a big question in my mind. You hear about the college wage premium, and I've always wondered, like, is it really the college wage premium or is it the cognitive skills premium? And, if we could control for the cognitive skills, how much additional, value add is there from college? And it sounds like there's probably some, but it is hard to disentangle that, right?
Yeah, so I don't think that this paper is going to offer any definitive conclusions about the college wage premium, if for no other reason that we're talking about British people who were born in 1958 in a particular week. But for what it's worth, the paper does suggest that the cognitive gains in college are kind of similar to those that are associated with high school. However, the wage gains are much bigger in college, which sort of suggests that either that the college is a really big signal, right? That helps you get into these sort of higher wage earning professions, or that we're just not able to measure the things that college is teaching people. And I think that's really kind of the frustrating thing about the paper, if I'm being honest, is that the measures of cognitive ability are so general. And I'm sure they're valid, but we all just know that once you're getting into college and the workforce, just because it doesn't show up on an ELA or math test doesn't mean you're not learning anything, right? The higher you get up the educational food chain, the more specialized you get, the less those skills are going to show up on these sort of general measures of cognitive ability, if you want to call it that. And so, to be honest, that made me all a little bit skeptical that we really know what's going on here. Because it's just very hard to distinguish between workforce readiness and these specialized measures of ability.
Very well said. We will leave it there. David, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting stuff, even though we have to end on a note of skepticism. But that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.